Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this last panel of the day. Our panel is entitled Tunisia Today, Politics, Protest and Partisans. My name is Rania, Masri, Associate Director of the Asfari Institute for Civil Society and Citizenship. And I'm really thrilled to be moderating this panel, particularly because I had the privilege to have already read your papers, and they're excellent, so you're all in for a treat. Our first paper is entitled The Political Behavior of Economic Outsiders, Informal Labor, Unemployed Graduates, and the Roots of Social Discontent. That paper is written by three experts, the first of whom is Helen Milner, Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton University, and the director of the Neuhaus Center for Globalization and Governance at Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School. Dr. Milner is interested in issues related to international and comparative political economy, the connections between domestic politics and foreign policy, globalization and regionalism, and the relationship between democracy and trade policy. The paper is also co-written by Amaney Jamal, who is professor of politics, also at Princeton University, and director of the Mamdouha Bobst Center for Peace and Justice. Dr. Jamal is also the president of the Association of Middle East Women's Studies, and the focus of her current research is democratization and the politics of civic engagement in the Arab world. Her interests also include the study of Muslim and Arab Americans and the pathways that structure their patterns of civic engagements in the United States. Dr. Jamal will be presenting later on this evening at 5:30 on a very uplifting topic, which is Trump's presidency, or as we in the States like to call him, God's greatest job creator in the history of U.S. presidents. Dude. Can't forget the word dude when talking about Trump. The third writer for the first paper, and also the person who will be presenting the paper, is Ms. Chantal Berman, who's a PhD candidate in political science at Princeton University, and her research focuses on social movements and social policy in contemporary North Africa. We're going to go directly from the first paper to the second paper and then opening it up for questions. And our second paper is entitled University Graduates and the Inhabitants of Marginalized Regions, Explaining the Weakness of Unemployed Activism in Tunisia. And this is a paper that has been researched by also several individuals. Samiha Hamdi, a PhD candidate at the University of Languages and Human Sciences of Sfax in Tunisia. Samiha was not able to be with us today. And rather, Weipert-Fenner, thank you, will be presenting the research, and she's also a researcher in that paper. Eileen is a research fellow at the Peace Research Institute Frankfurt, and she holds a PhD in political science from Goethe University. Dr. Eileen also directs a multilateral research group on socio-economic protest and political transformations in Egypt and Tunisia. So clearly we're thrilled to have such an exquisite panel. Each presenter will have approximately 20 minutes, and then we will open the floor for your questions and comments. So with that,
okay, great. Thank you, Rania. Thank you, all of you, for coming to our session. I know it's late in the afternoon. And I want to extend our thanks to the organizers of this event as well. It's really cool to be here in Beirut. So this is, again, joint work with Amaney Jamal and Helen Milner. And like some of the great work we saw earlier today, this paper is aiming to shed light on the structure of socioeconomic grievances in contemporary Tunisia, and more specifically to think about what is mediating the relationship between economic marginalization and political change in the region today. As noted earlier, many have argued in the past few years that this groundswell of pro-democracy agitation in the region over the past decade, including but certainly not limited to the 2011 uprisings, has been motivated by a sense of economic injustice. That citizens in these states are responding to a violation of the social contract that promised things like employment and economic security in exchange for their political cooperation. This notion of a linkage between economic grievance on the one hand and anti-authoritarian behavior on the other resonates strongly with a large literature in political science that views regime change as a byproduct of class conflict, where poor citizens will agitate for democracy because of their interest in redistribution and achieving a more economically just society. We can wait a few minutes if people want to get settled. Great. So this paper is going to offer an historically grounded refinement on the production and activation of economic grievances in cases of regime transition, specifically Tunisia. We're going to be using a uniquely detailed labor market survey, a household survey of Tunisians, to explore two key claims. First, we argue that socioeconomic grievances, as well as the propensity to blame economic hardship on state mismanagement, are largely determined by an individual's labor market position. That is to say, whether a person is an employee in the public sector, a formal employee in the private sector, an informal worker, or unemployed. Yet these grievances do not translate directly into political behavior. Rather, we argue that the propensity to take anti-authoritarian or pro-democracy political action on behalf of these grievances is mediated by an individual's level of education. More specifically, we aim to show that educated outsiders, those citizens who are either unemployed or informally employed and who hold a bachelor's degree or higher in terms of education, have the same high socioeconomic grievances as their uneducated counterparts, but are far more likely to participate in political life, both through electoral politics and through social movements, protest, and of course participation in the 2011 uprising. Mixing high economic insecurity with high political efficacy, we argue that educated outsiders, as we call them, have become among Tunisia's biggest pro-democracy agitators. So as many have also argued, employment and the benefits that come with it, such as social security coverage, have long been a mainstay of social support offered by states in the region. And demands relating to labor and the scarcity of jobs have come to play a large role in political life in recent years. Our inquiry is grounded in the observation that Tunisia, like many other states in the region, is witnessing right now a significant shift in the demographic composition of unemployment. Whereas in the 1990s, the unemployed were primarily low-skilled, low-educated people. This is captured in this graphic in red, the percent of unemployment with only primary education. We see over the past 25 years this drastic rise in the percent of the unemployed who hold a bachelor's degree or higher, which is captured here in blue, the percent of unemployment with tertiary education. The percentage of the unemployed who have a university education was greater than 30% by the time of the Jasmine Revolution. And I want to note that although we don't have similar time series data on the educated status of informal workers, contextual evidence as well as our own survey suggests a similar trend. Now, to what extent is this a regional or perhaps even a global problem, this phenomenon of unemployed graduates, as we call it in the region? With the sometimes spotty data that is available to us, and this is World Development Indicators, we can see that some other Arab states, notably those that witnessed mobilization to some degree in 2011, are also seeming to fit this trend. Jordan and Egypt, in particular, look a lot like Tunisia over the past 10 through 15 years, but we don't really have the tail end of the Egypt time series. And Morocco has a similar positive trajectory if the slope is overall a little bit less severe. And a second comparative graph, again with regions data as available from World Development Indicators, shows that Arab states may really be something of an anomaly in terms of this measure of unemployed graduates. Other regions, we have here the EU, Eastern Europe, and Latin America and the Caribbean, don't appear to mirror anything like the trends we're seeing in Tunisia in terms of this demography of unemployment. And Tunisia is, again, this very steep curve captured here in purple. Now, this apparent shift in terms of who is being left out of labor markets, and by extension, who is lacking in the economic protections offered by the state to workers, is not incidental. Instead, we believe that this demographic rise of unemployed graduates reflects specific developmental choices on behalf of the successive regimes in Tunisia. And we can situate this population at the intersection of two major trends. The first trend is, understandably, the rapid expansion of university education throughout different social sectors in Tunisia. Tunisia, much like neighboring countries, has historically spent heavily on ensuring the availability of public education access for an expanding array of social groups, that is to say, not just the elites. This spending is quite heavily weighted towards the university level. In terms of university education specifically, Tunisia outspends both the OECD average and the middle income country average, to produce a growth rate of university graduates throughout the 2000s that's about 14%. This is extremely high, far beyond, for example, the rate of economic growth during this time. And moving on, as political economy scholars of the region have often noted, the creation of this educated workforce has far outpaced the creation of secure jobs matched to the high skill level of younger cohorts. Job prospects for graduates in Tunisia have been undermined, among other factors, by privatization of previously state-operated sectors, as well as growth promotion strategies that are centered on low-skill sorts of localized sectors, things like tourism, things like textile manufacturing. And this lack of a fit between the high skill level of the population, or at least the high education status of the population, and the range of jobs that are available and growing fits under this rubric of the mismatch hypothesis of labor markets. Now, setting aside for a moment this question of education, we want to note that while unemployment is rampant in Tunisia, this is often discussed as one of the motivating factors behind unrest, an even larger percentage of the population is subject to informal employment, which is captured here in this bar graph. Informal employment means, in our survey, those who are working without an official job contract and without access to Social Security coverage. And in contrast to those who are employed either in public sector work or in the private formal sector, informal workers have no access to labor protections. Most often they are not unionized, and they may lose their jobs or lose income without recourse. And this dualization, we say, of Tunisia's labor markets mirrors trends that have been studied from a political perspective in Europe and elsewhere, with the expectation being that precarious workers, informal workers, have fundamentally different interests and political outlooks than do their compatriots in formal sector jobs. We use these theories to generate our first and second hypotheses to be tested with our survey data, namely that economic outsiders, meaning both informal workers and the unemployed, should report higher levels of economic insecurity, and second, that outsiders will blame their marginalized status on state failure, reporting in turn lower evaluations of state economic management in a number of policy areas. And to bring education back on the political side, we believe it is university education that translates the profound grievances of economic outsiders into political action. University training both raises the expectations of citizens for rights and security and socializes them to act collectively. We see this in the high level of political activity on campuses throughout the region and high levels of involvement in student unions, such as Tunisia's UJET. Education's role is further evidenced in that we see a lot of social contention, not from associations of the unemployed per se, but rather from these groups of unemployed graduates, such as Tunisia's UDC or Morocco's ANDCM. These groups are heavily involved in different areas of contestation throughout the second half of the 2000s and up to the present, and this wealth of mobilization motivates our third and fourth survey hypotheses. Third, that university-educated outsiders should hold the same grievances as uneducated counterparts, but they should be more politically active than uneducated outsiders. And fourth, that they should show greater propensity towards a democratic political system. Now, to get into some data, I'm going to show you a series of OLS and logistic models run on a large household survey of nearly 6,000 Tunisians that was run in the spring of 2015. This survey had a unique labor force battery, allowing us quite a bit of insight into each individual's job position, formal or informal status, as well as their work history. So turning to these models, our first hypothesis is largely supported here. We see that outsiders, again, the informal and the unemployed, are much more economically insecure when it comes to things like job tenure as well as income and earnings. And I want to note that these models include covariates, including log age, gender, and education, and that these comparative trends between insiders and outsiders in different analyses are found to hold both within these broader categories and within the subsets of these groups that are university educated. And I want to note also, in the interest of time, we have a range of other grievance-type questions in the paper, and can show you more of those if you're interested in the Q&A. So our second hypothesis was that outsiders, informal and unemployed, should report lower evaluations of state performance in terms of managing the economy. And we see this to be largely true in questions pertaining to reducing poverty, for example, reducing inequality, as well as keeping the cost of living down. And we believe that this is an important sort of intervening steps in terms of linking feelings of personal insecurity with this broader sense of, perhaps I am insecure because of state failure. Perhaps I am insecure because the state is not picking up the job of taking care of me, taking care of my family. So given these attitudes or grievances, and based on a broad economic theory of regime choice, again, this idea that the most economically disadvantaged will be those agitating for a transition towards democracy, we might expect economic outsiders to be more active in a range of behaviors that are seen as pro-democracy or that are helping to bring about this new political order. And yet we actually don't see much evidence for this at all. We see very little differentiation, for example, in terms of voting, party support, which is not pictured here, and actually a slight reversal of expectations where public sector workers are slightly more involved in either every protest activity and revolutionary behavior. And we believe that this last observation is basically a factor of high union density among public employees and the historical militancy of certain public sectors, such as education. With this null result in mind, we turn to our hypotheses that university graduate status is in fact driving political participation among those with high socioeconomic grievances, economic outsiders. In terms of participation in institutionalized politics, informal grads and unemployed grads, as we see here, are more likely to vote by nearly 30 points and are twice as likely as the uneducated informal and the uneducated unemployed to be involved in campaigns. Now, when it comes to non-institutionalized means of political participation, namely social movements, we see that educated outsiders are protesting more by wide margins, both prior to and after the 2011 revolution. We also see a very similar relationship when it comes to having protested or not during the 2011 uprising by a large difference of about 15 points. And finally, we had hypothesized that educated outsiders would also be greater Democrats than uneducated outsiders. And this is partially confirmed, though perhaps not as strongly as the previous hypotheses. Our informal grads in particular are of the opinion that democratic systems are very good, and we see results as well, though less statistically significant, over the question of whether authoritarian systems are, quote unquote, very good. So we believe that this tepidness about democracy among our uneducated outsiders may be partially driven through the belief that democracy means a weak economy. These individuals by 2015, which again is when we ran the survey, are likely frustrated with the slow progress of delivering on revolutionary goals of greater economic opportunity. Uneducated outsiders, we note here, are also more likely to cast votes for a party representing major figures affiliated to the old regime. And this is in the case of Tunisia, it's Nideh Tunis. And for those of us who study Tunisia, we know that a large part of Nideh's electoral strategy in the 2014 elections, directly prior to this survey, was of course this notion of, trust us, we know how to create economic growth, we know how to create jobs, getting the economy back on track, and so on. So to wrap this up, we have argued that socioeconomic grievances are largely correlated to labor market position, but that the activation of these grievances for pro-democracy action is determined by education, specifically university education. Unemployed graduates and unemployed informal workers are argued in this case to be the class of democracy based on their participation in a range of actions and behaviors, both in electoral politics and in social mobilization. Second, while many have spoken to the political consequences of unemployment in the region, we want to move past the dichotomy of employed or not, particularly with regards to the large phenomenon of informal employment. In almost every measure, those who are informally employed without contracts, without benefits, are more similar to the unemployed than they are to public and formal private sector workers. So we're interested in repositioning this cleavage, if you will, for who is considered as belonging to this group of economically marginalized for the sake of individual level analyses. And finally, and this is a sort of broader conceptual point, perhaps in comparative politics, Through this historical framework, we're observing that Tunisian leaders, through specific developmental choices, have created this class of people, educated outsiders, perhaps most motivated to oppose them and most capable of doing so. So in the spirit of Goodwin's famous observation that states create their own oppositions, we support a sort of conceptual move towards thinking of the demographic or a class basis for democratic transition in modern autocracies, not as exogenously given, but rather as a mid to long-term consequence of specific state-building policies. So that is going to wrap up our presentation. Again, we have a few more slides on additional outcomes you might be interested in, so feel free to pose those questions. And we're looking forward to your comments and suggestions for moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Berman. Very exciting presentation. Dr. Amaney.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for having me here. Unfortunately not us. Samiha fell sick just 2 days ago, so it will be only me presenting our results of field research, or several extensive field research we have been doing on Tunisia. But as Rania, thanks for the kind introduction, mentioned before, our paper is situated within a larger research project, which is called Socioeconomic Protest and Political Transformation, Dynamics of Contentious Politics in Egypt and Tunisia against the background of South American experiences. So we have an interregional comparison inbuilt in the project that I won't have time to talk about. But I'd just like to mention that this is a cooperative project together with the Arab Forum for Alternatives, a think tank based in Cairo, and the University of Sfax. And we are generously funded by the Volkswagen Foundation, I should mention too. So coming to our paper on unemployed activism in Tunisia, I'm going to present a comparative study of the Union of Unemployed Graduates, or UDC in the French acronym that you mentioned already, which is more my part of the paper, and the unemployed mobilization in the Gafsa mining basin, which is more Samiha's part, but we did some field research together in Gafsa, so I hope I can cover these questions coming up here too. Okay, I should mention, field research. So we're using, well, we are both qualitative people, so we did a lot of semi-structured interviews, focus groups, and also participant observation. For my part, this was, I was there since every year since 2014, and also participated in the World Social Forum, where I had the chance to see interaction between socioeconomic activists in Tunisia. And Samiha has been working on Gafsa since 2014, if I remember correctly. So what are we talking about, actually? As we heard already, unemployment is the most pressing socioeconomic problem, and on the one hand, and on the other, we have the activists' perspective that nothing has changed. Unemployment, and this is maybe something we should discuss later on, from the perspective of the activists we interviewed, actually includes people who also work in the informal sector or underemployed people. So this includes people with like limited contracts or too low salaries to actually have autonomous livelihood, like proper, decent salaries. Unemployed activism has been the most important category of social protest in Tunisia, and remember the regional and national uprisings that were triggered by protests for employment, thinking of the 6-month revolt in the Gafsa mining base in 2008, the revolution that started in 2010 in the marginalized interior regions. 2015 we had a regional wave of unemployed protests in Gafsa again. In 2016 you might remember the approximately like 10 days revolt that started in Kasrin this time, but spread to other interior regions, but then even to Tunis. So having unemployment, like being well aware that it's a pressing problem and having a lot of activism, but on the other hand, having a problem that there's actually no political impact so far of the mobilization, the question that we would like to ask or to answer in this paper, at least partly, is how can we explain the lack of political leverage that we see here in Tunisia? And we'd like to focus on the dynamics of this social movement, trying to find some answers. And we will look at 3 dimensions that help explain this observation. So first, we will be looking at the social meaning of grievances. That is also referred to this new kind of literature around Erica Simmons, to dig deeper on grievances, not only looking about the severity of grievances, but actually reconstruct the social meaning of it. We'll be looking at mobilization structures and the perceived political opportunities and threats of the activists. Very, very brief introduction to the unemployed protest that we see in the Gafsa mining basin. You might be familiar with this map of Tunisia. The red areas, regions are the marginalized regions that are considered as underdeveloped, and Gafsa is right in the middle. Here you see protests of 2008, the rebel I just mentioned, so actually mass protests, large numbers of people. But here 2 pictures that Samiha took show the variety of protests when I actually talk of contention here. So there might be just 20 people on the street, or maybe, I'm not sure if you actually see it, there's a tent here, and they block a railroad. And this is also a precedent that I witnessed, so you could even overlook it if you didn't know it was there. So this is a pluralist phenomenon. You see the graph here, this is data that has been collected by the Forum Tunisien de Droits Économiques et Sociaux, of a Tunisian NGO specialized in socio-economic protests. And these are numbers of socio-economic protests in the Gafsa region. You see, like in waves, an increase of protests here, which makes sense when you look at the unemployment rates, particularly the unemployed among university, like almost 50% university rates. So their hotspots of protests are the 4 mining cities of Darayes, Metlawi, and Dila. And the major demand is employment in the CPG, the Compagnie Phosphate de Gafsa. I'll come back to this in a second. And the interesting thing is that actually there has been an increase of workers, of employed people there, from 5,000 roughly in 2008 up to 30,000 by now 2014. But as you can see, the protests continue. Short introduction to the UDC. We just heard how important the problem of unemployment among university graduates is. Only in 2006 there were actually a few former student union members of the UJET who formed the UDC while they were protesting in front of the Ministry of Interior. They were denied any access, and this was kind of the trigger, like not being integrated or included in any kinds of negotiation or dialogue. It triggered the foundation of the UDC. They started off with 3 local offices, already starting out to the regions, to Jendouba and Radaif, which is in Gafsa, next to the Tunis office, and they started off with a few hundred members. They participated in the Gafsa revolt of 2008 and the national uprising of 2010, and played kind of facilitating role, like supported these protests and in terms of organization, but they were not the key driver. However, the slogan traveled, شغل حرية كرامة وطنية, work, freedom and national dignity, was invented by them in 2006 and it was picked up in 2008 in Gafsa and also became a major slogan of the national uprising in 2010 and 11. So after 2011, they expanded in membership extremely, up to 16,000 members. They have regional offices now in every governorate and up to 70 local offices. They held internal elections in 2013. You see here the Secretary General Salam Al-Ayari. There will be new elections soon, but so far he has been the Secretary General. And also here we see increased activism and waves of mobilization. The graph you see here is actually data that we compiled we used UDC Facebook posts. As soon as they started to use Facebook on a larger scale, which is we found September 2011. We collected all, like from declarations to protest events, sit-ins, everything they posted. And I have to say that doesn't tell us anything about the impact. Okay? It doesn't tell us how many people actually participated in a protest, they posted on it, how many bystanders would see that event. So this is really just about the activist perspective and what they did. But as you see, it increased, so it's worth looking at it more precisely. So I'm coming now to the comparison. But first, we would like to compare the social meaning of unemployment. First, in Gaza, there are different kinds of injustices invoked in Gaza when it comes to unemployment. First, it's being poor in spite of the natural richness of phosphate. This very strategic, important natural resource. There's the regional imbalances. You remember the map, blue and red, like being red while the others are blue. So being part of the impoverished interior regions, while all the investment still, until today, goes to the coastal regions. But there's also a factor, like a temporal factor, it's the decline of the situation over time. As one activist said, it's paradise lost. And this has to do with the CPG. Brief excursus. The CPG is a public sector company and has been since independence. This parts were founded by the French. But, and this is the important part for us, from the 1950s and 60s on, the CPG provided jobs, infrastructure, health services, leisure, including sporting clubs and grocery stores, so basically everything. So this was kind of part of the old social contract, welfare provision, in exchange to loyalty. Then the structural adjustment program since the 1980s forced the CPG to reduce its labor force and also to withdraw from the provision of services. However, or until today, employment in the CPG is still seen as an access to a valuable package of social protection, as usual when it comes to public sector employment. And in fact, within the region, there is no alternative available. And now, like the trigger for most of the outbursts, like the specific trigger, were recruitment procedures that were perceived as corrupt. So when job lists were published and certain people were expected to be on that list and weren't. So corruption and also clientelist networks happen to be a trigger of discontent whenever like mass mobilization happens. Looking at the UDC grievances, we have one thing that is connecting, this is connected to the thing of unemployment, or we think about youth unemployment. So they share the feature that all people who are actually activists have never been employed before. So they're actually waiting for inclusion, or what Diane Singerman called waithood. They're still stuck in this adolescence phase. They want to shift to adulthood, but without proper job, without proper employment, this is not going to happen. For the UDC, also the marginalization of interior regions is a topic, an important one. But of course, specific to unemployed graduates is the question of education and the violation of meritocratic principles that come with it. Higher education, as we all know, is not a guarantee for social mobility anymore, and this is outcried by the activists themselves. Again, the public recruitment procedures, in their case, is the concours system, the access to the civil service jobs is blocked by clientelist and patronage networks. And there are certain forms of waithood, or how waithood is managed, that they rebel against too, like kind of internships for graduate people, or the concours system itself, when you feel like there are no jobs to be actually distributed, that this is just fake, and just keeping us busy, we're just waiting for the next round of concours. Interestingly, UDC, in its demands, doesn't pick up on the education topic that much. So the Facebook posts that we collected, education hardly played a role. Sometimes this concours system, but not like for example, a critique of the education system itself that I heard in interviews, but not, and it doesn't really matter for their mobilization. Coming to mobilizing structures, in Gaza, local networks are extremely important, and this is one of the major observations. They are increasingly important. We see an increasing fragmentation. So most of the units that mobilize are on a family or clan level. Graduates are separated from non-graduates. And there's support of local UGTT, the trade union federation offices, but not of regional and the national level anymore. This changed during 2010. In 2008, we had similar dynamics. parts of local UGTT branches would support local mobilization of unemployed. For the UDC, the pre-existing student union network is extremely important. They rely also on the UGTT, which they're associated with being part of this leftist camp, together with UGT and UGTT. However, we see a dynamic since 2011, and this is a losing cohesion within the leftist camp. And on top of that, also within UDC, you can see that there are local dynamics, that the local branches are pretty autonomous, and there's no concerted action. So when we compare these two, we can see that first of all, the most striking thing is actually that UDC and the unemployed, the unorganized unemployed, don't work together. And this all has to do with a certain mistrust towards other societal actors and also political actors that I come back in a second, that leads to an increasing fragmentation between organized and unorganized, but even within the organization of the UDC. When you would see that actually local branches would go for sit-ins, protests, hunger strikes increasingly, but having no national agenda or something or strategy how to bring forces together, when it's more about for the national office than to support local offices with some kind of media attention whatsoever, but not really working together in that sense, which resembles, when you look at the protest strategies, you can see that unorganized, unemployed, and local UDC offices are similar, because what they protest for is actually personal employment and not a broader strategy. So this brings me to my final dimension of comparison. When you look at GAFSA activists and UDC activists on the local level, we see that the new freedom since 2011 provided more opportunities for protest that both types of unemployed use. There's a lack of public attention and an increasingly negative public opinion of protests, so that leads to more disruptive and attention-creating forms of protest. In the GAFSA region, it's more about blocking streets. For the UDC, it's more about hunger strikes. Both organized and unorganized fear being instrumentalized by political actors. So even to the leftist party alliance, the Front Populaire, there is no trust that could actually work together. But there's also mistrust against societal actors and even the really important trade union federation, UGTT. There's a high preference for negotiations of single protest groups, and those are really tiny at times, to directly negotiate with regional or even national government level. So apart from that, you can see that UDC on the national level tried to develop a political agenda to be more critical on the economic model, for example, to trigger kind of critical debates here, and also attempt to coordinate different local and regional activists or activities. But bringing this all together, we can see that the fragmentation of the movement caused by lack of trust in political parties, lack of trust in societal actors, and even in other unemployed activists, might explain the lack of political leverage. And this is in spite of the fact that they're actually mobilizing large numbers of people, in particular the marginalized interior regions and GAFSA in this case. Their demands are limited in political scope, so saying just personal employment, self-employment, but the problem is most of them focus on state employment, which, well, at least should be discussed if this is the path forward or if this is unsustainable on the long run. But demands or the discussion doesn't go much further. And when there are broader political demands, as the National UDC Office formulates, then we have to say that the capacity of the National Office is really low to mobilize in a larger extent to build up pressure. So taking all these dynamics together, I think it makes clear why it is easy for, what has been easy for the government to stick to old tactics, and maybe something that you're investigating further, to provide jobs on occasionally to some groups, some people, which increases, of course, the fragmentation. The incentive structure is simply, and we know it from other cases, as I said, we also compare it to Egypt, as long as protests remain like social, the demands remain social and not political, the regime would give concessions. And as soon as it turns political, then this becomes a threat. And so by keeping up this incentive structure, we can see that so far, I mean, this is not a sustainable strategy, for sure not. I mean, how now Tunisia is again in IMF negotiations, there's always this discourse about shrinking the public sector. So there is no real debate about this unemployment problem, but there's also no debate with the unemployed. And I think I want to conclude with this to say that there hasn't been an attempt to actually include unemployed into a kind of dialogue forum, which Tunisia is so famous for. There is a social dialogue with the UGTT and the Businessman Association together with the government agreed on a new social contract. They call it a social contract, and although they got stuck in negotiating it further, there is some kind of debate. But unemployed people don't really get access to it, which of course partly is explained by their fragmentation. If they don't form organizations, it's difficult to include them. But even the UDC offering somehow a well-organized organization and you know, that could talk, that could negotiate, has been excluded so far. Yeah, I'll leave it with this. Thank you.
Thank you both for that presentation and for sticking exactly to time, both of you. We'd like to open the floor for your questions and comments. I'll take around 3 or 4 questions at a time and then bring it back to the speakers. And if I could just ask you to please introduce yourself while you give your question or comment, that would be appreciated.
Can I push the button here? Hi, my name is Rania Kurtz, Montclair State University. Thank you, Chantal, for this sort of great quantification of a known phenomenon, at least for those who work in the field and do social movements. So it's been sort of a nice first stab at a comprehensive approach to that. And thank you to you, Helen, to sort of also a very complete longitudinal analysis of the GAFSA situation. Based on what you said last, Chantal, states create their own oppositions. My good friend Jeff Goodwin. I want you to look, both of you, Irene and Chantal, sort of look at educated as well as uneducated, and you said graduate and non-graduates, right? And so it might be more PC to say non-graduates than graduates versus uneducated, educated. So I want you to look at this, and maybe because the crux of our conference today is sort of social justice. But I think we can't look at it if we keep sort of the political aspects out of it. And when we look at what happened in the last couple of years in Tunisia with the rise of sort of these terrorist attacks, right? So there's a security angle to it that overshadows things at large. And so I'd like you to think in terms of, I've written on sort of the securitization of the political discourse in Tunisia. And so I would like you to look at, or maybe expand to what extent then what impact is there, or what perceptions and actions are there with regards to these two different groups of unemployed with regards to their actions on the ground. Their perceptions and then their actions. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, please.
Hello, my name is Nawal Belahter. I'm a research associate and PhD candidate in Free University of Berlin, working on social movements in Nigeria. Yes, thanks for the two very interesting presentations. Irene, it's the second time I listen to your presentation. I'm always fascinated how many parallels we have with the Algerian case. And actually, I was I'm just thinking out loud. I thought it was really interesting what you developed at the end about the exclusion of this actor that, on the one hand, was celebrated as the figure of the Tunisian revolution, and it's interesting to see that 5 years after the revolution, or even more, these figures are excluded and are not really taking part in the debate. And I'm wondering, is it also what they intend to? I mean, do they want to to be stuck on the local level, you know, and do they want to fight for, you know, their individual, job opportunities? Or, and here I'm having the Algerian case in mind. The Algerian unemployed are also asking for a general revolution, for social justice for everyone. So I'm wondering if there wasn't a shift in the discourse among the Tunisian unemployed graduates. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Nadim, just a student. I just wanted to ask a question.
Not just a student, just the university students, yes.
That's why we're all here.
Yes.
The local student. I just wanted to ask a question to the Ms. Chantal. Concerning, I just wanted to get, before I engage in I guess a small critique, but is your conclusion that educated people mobilize more than non-educated people?
Specifically within the sort of outsider or people with high grievances, yes.
Right. And then you also tried to make a claim that they're more democratic. Yet your graph seemed to refute that same statement.
Just if you could answer.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, you made two statements, correct? Like, one, they're more democratic, two, they mobilize. Yet the democratic one, you yourself showed that it's not really that consistent. There's a difference between informal and unemployed graduates in being democratic. So that, it seems like you, right? So that's not true, that people who are educated are more democratic, given that you yourself showed that it's not true.
In that specific question, so I think, I'm going to put this back up, but I think, in the specific question, do you support a democracy more? I think it was the unemployed graduates who were more supportive of that, and then within the informal graduates, we didn't actually see that much differentiation, right? So it's kind of a partial confirmation of the specific sort of like what we call pro-democracy attitudes, or even the sort of pro-authoritarian attitudes, yeah.
My question is, okay, so even if one takes for granted that this is true, the question is why? Did you just assume that there's an obvious relationship between education and mobilization? What is if I don't see a causal mechanism, I just think it's a correlation. So is it because university kids, students have access to resources, mobilizing structures like the unions, like so then it's not education, it's mobilization, it's mobilizing resources, it's capacities, what about threats and repression? What about the international / regional dynamics? Ideology, so I don't know, it just seemed too hasty or rather unexplained, just even if one takes a descriptive fact, what's the causal reason beyond just that? And how do you make sense of people like Gilbert Achcar's analysis? I saw some names, but I didn't see Gilbert Achcar, and he gave one of the, I think, more convincing arguments for why the revolutions and the happening in the region in the book that people want. And he stresses that it's more about rentier states and patrimonial regimes in combination with capitalist with development that leads to this crisis. You gave a graph that showed Tunisia in comparison to the EU. It's not a fair comparison. You can't compare, unemployment in graduates between the EU as a whole and Tunisia as a country. Why not just Greece?
Yeah, it's World Development Indicator, so this is kind of what we're working with, right?
But the comparison,
region and aggregate.
Is there a fourth question, or shall I slip this my role? Okay. I was listening to your presentation on Tunis on education and activism, and it brought up a lot of similarities with what's been happening in Lebanon. And I've got lots of questions, but I'm just going to limit them to two. Anecdotally, from our work in Lebanon, we found out that over the years, the ones that protest with their bodies more, in the sense that they're the ones that are willing to face physical arrest and physical harassment from the police force and the security forces more than others, happen to be the non-graduates, thank you for that term, the non-graduated unemployed, more than those who are have graduate degrees and or are employed. And I'm wondering if you found there was that relationship also in Tunis, or if you were able to look at that. This specifically looking at the modes of activism. So not just do we go to a protest, but our behaviors within the protest. How much are we willing to risk within the protest? And my other question, and again, I'm not sure if you looked into this, but I would just find it to be very intriguing. Within those who have graduate degrees or have higher education, however way you want to look at that, did you find, or did you conduct any studies to look at their political outtakes? Because even if we say pro-democracy or pro-authoritarian, that's still very wide. Did you find those who were leaning more towards economic justice, believing in more of what is considered now a leftist approach to economics, versus those that believe more in state security and capitalistic, individualistic approach to economics or to justice, so to speak. And my question for you had nothing to do with your presentation, but it's really about your own research, and I'm wondering if you uncovered, or what similarities you actually uncovered between the research that you've done in Tunis and between research that you have done or maybe doing in South America. So if we could even open up that line, because I found it to be very intriguing.
Great. Yeah, so to take the first question, if I understand correctly, your question was about this question of graduates versus non-graduates in relation to the perception of security threat or support of this sort of like unemployed radicalization.
Exactly, in this new state environment, right? And so even human rights activists, if we take the graduates, they had to scale down. Thank you. So they basically also had to scale down with regards to what they post or what they say, and so to look at these two categories, non-graduates and graduates. What the perception is then with regards to what the state discourse is with the, in addition to the socioeconomic factors. So more from a security or political angle, if you will.
Right, so whether they're sort of sensing a sense of threat from the state.
Exactly. Because in a sense they were questioning the state with regards to we want the state to provide, we want our jobs, right? And the state responds. That's why I said Goodwin's piece about the state is gracious, and they create their own opposition, saying, we're going to shut them up, right? And so then they do this via the monopoly of violence, right? And so what's the response, the reaction towards that?
So whether they're like dealing with a different sense of repression based on the fact that whether they're graduates or non-graduates. So that's an interesting question. And I think potentially also can speak to this question about the mechanisms of mobilization. What is it about graduate status and university education that's actually acting on these people? So we haven't been able to do any of the empirical work on perceptions of threat from the state. We don't have those questions, and they're kind of difficult to get at with observational survey data for a lot of reasons. But if I had to sort of put forward some speculation, I would say that there probably is some of that, specifically within the graduate population when we talk about this propensity to act collectively and the experience that a lot of people have, gaining experience acting collectively within the university environment, right? So within specifically the universities of Tunis, and I'm less familiar with the sort of political environments of the universities in the interior regions, there's tremendous involvement in student unionization, for example, which will sort of act on behalf of everything from, student got sick and missed a test, they'll mobilize on their behalf towards, acting in a much sort of broader political sense in the national environment. So there really is this process through which a lot of people through the university system sort of develop these social networks. They are mobilized, they are like imbued with resources, and those networks, as I think Rania was pointing out, can sort of last them out of the university environment. They may become involved in like UDSA, for example, within those same networks. So I think, there probably is a sense of perhaps collective security within people who have mobilized within the university environment and then moving forward, if that addresses the question. Yeah, and then on the second question, this is also a great question. So I can't speak specifically to the book that people want, as I haven't yet read it. But when we're talking about this idea of sort of, what does democracy support, which is a great question. So we, I think, are trying to think a little bit broadly about the idea of democratic political behavior or democracy support, which is why we have, so many graphs in this presentation and the paper as well. So to think of it not just in terms of, as you say, perhaps this one question of do you like democracy or do you not like democracy, and not so much as this sort of one moment of political behavior, do you come out during the 2011 uprisings, but rather as this sort of broader set of democratic practices, from whether you're voting, whether you're involved in campaigns, yes, whether you are protesting and what your sort of role in social movement activity is. So I think that's our sort of democratic thrust argument, right? So perhaps it's not so specific to the democracy versus you like authoritarianism indicators, and we're sort of thinking more about what are the behaviors, what are the attitudes, what are the practices that sort of makes that when practiced collectively are sort of like moving forward in this practice of democracy. So that's a bit broader. And then with the mechanisms, I think you sort of identified, I think quite similar to what we were thinking, this idea of socialization towards acting collectively, of course, the resource, I don't think probably less in terms of material resources, more in terms of networked resources, you know, becoming educated or woke, I guess, about like previous social movements and sort of the capacity to act collectively is a big one in the university environment. And also I think a set of, and I didn't speak to this that much, but perhaps a heightened set of expectations, right? Because a lot of the historical political economy literature for the region is really pointing to this idea that in previous generations, a lot more people who were university graduates were able to move fairly easily into public sector work in particular, which is very well compensated and it's secure and it's kind of long-term. And with the current cohort, we see, maybe this is more of a cohort effect, you have much less of that sort of security. So you have kind of a breakage in this connection between the expectation that I have achieved this level of education, my parents see that I've achieved this level of education, and yet like I can't move into perhaps the secure employment that, you know, people with my qualifications even 10, 15, 25 years ago would have expected. So I think those are the two primary mechanisms we're thinking about, the raising of expectations based on the fact that you are educated, as well as the sort of social mobilization and the social networks that are present in the university sector. And then in terms of modes of activism, I think this is a great question. Unfortunately, we don't have, I think, data on like who's taking on what roles in protests. I think it would be very interesting to look, you know, perhaps within specific mobilization communities, like who is taking over leadership, who is taking over a directing role, who is even, you know, taking the time and place of the action, who's directing action. I think it's more of a qualitative or perhaps interpretive kind of question that we can get at through some other kind of materials, so we don't have it in the survey work so much.
Okay, well, thanks a lot also from my side for the questions. Pick and choose and try to bring them all together. Starting with the question if there was a shift in discourse. Okay, from the UDC, no, okay, starting from another take. Actually, we have, so it's a cooperative project, and our PhD student at PRIF works with large data sets, the ACOL data set on armed conflicts, and here we could distill, if you want, the protest demands, like in general, like social economic protests and their demands since 2011. And here we could actually see, yes, from broader demands, we could see a development towards more specific, more group and remote-based related demands. From the UDC, a study that I did, I couldn't show this graph, unfortunately there was no time. But with the demands, the major demands of UDC are first, well, not surprisingly related to employment. Second, to the recruitment procedures. And third, and this is a new category that comes up after 2014, and this is reaction to state responses to their protests. And these are mainly two. One is they protest or mobilize against repression and against being ignored. So this brings me back to this exclusion factor. So actually exclusion leads to mobilization in this case. Which brings me to the question of Anne, if I got your name right. So it's about how does the state deal with them, and in particular when you actually see the secularization of the, actually of the whole political agenda. So everything is becoming like second role when actually security, national unity, and these things are first. I think there's a repertoire of state responses, and security links to one major narrative. It's the not now narrative, or you need to be patient in the narrative. The sabr, I think it's widespread in the Middle East, and you find it here too. And this is how state responses link security to responses to social movements. And this is to say, first, it's not the time now to ask for socio-economic demands because now terrorism is the major threat. But second, and this is kind of, well, the dirty thing about the actual discourse at the moment, is to say that protests destabilize our country. They contribute to the chaos, they contribute to instability, and by that they delegitimize these protests too. But as I said, there's a set of state responses. I said, ignore the protests, repress them, postpone their demands to a day in the future when there will be enough to distribute. And this is a thing which the point that makes inclusion, exclusion questions so important, because even there might not be a full budget at the moment, a lot of money to distribute, there would still be the possibility to include people, to have first debates about what kind of economic model people would have in mind, to see this kind of pluralist understanding of where to go forward. But also, and I'd like to mention this once more, the corrupt recruitment procedures are always the trigger. And this could be something that could be reformed. You could increase transparency. You could do that, but no one's apparently interested in it. And this brings us to this continuity question that local regional networks applying to this patronage are still in place. Not much has changed on this level. There's not much interest also of the ruling elites among the Tunis in particular, but also, the Nahda, this deal like we don't talk about your past, let's talk about my past then. This seems to work, and you can see this transitional justice discourse. The law was actually very forward, straightforward in terms of social, economic development. For the first time, regions could be victims. And this brings me also to the question of what about lessons learned from Latin America or global comparison? What could we expect? Maybe we need to also lower our expectations when it comes to socio-economic mobilization and political outcomes. We did a comparative study on the role of labor unions in transitional justice processes, comparing South Africa, Argentina, and Tunisia. And we found that actually in general, trade unions, even if they're powerful, they are not very much throwing themselves into transitional justice processes, at least when it comes to socioeconomic rights. Because, oh God, I'm talking too much, but human rights, of course, also include economic, social, cultural rights, and we tend to forget about this. And trade unions could be the ones to remember or to remind us of it. But actually, in this comparison, we couldn't find this out. This is a chapter coming forward now with ICTJ, edited volume on transitional justice in context. We compared the unemployed movement of Tunisia with the unemployed movement of Argentina, which was the biggest unemployed movement of the world and very influential. And because actually most of the comparative literature is on Europe and America and the US, although the biggest movement came from Argentina. Well, this is something we discussed also in this paper, but the major findings or differences were the unemployed movement, the mass mobilization contributed to within regime shift in Argentina towards the Kirchners, who, actually changed economic policies and went more or less a neoliberal model. But they also integrated the unemployed organizations, divide and rule, the moderate ones. They became ministers or part of ministries. And another thing, they gave them funds for autonomous organization. So they gave them, okay, this is funds for unemployment benefits, and you go and organize yourself out. And that is how it finished for the in the early 2000s. Now we have a rise again. And to conclude, in general, we found that socio-economic mobilization, also in Latin America, was important, leading the way towards democratization. But afterwards, there was also a lack of political impact on the political agenda there. And there are limitations to this comparison, of course. So it's more of broadening the horizon of having more possibilities in mind how things can develop. And this is not a clean kind of a comparative case study model that we have here. But it helps to reflect also on the non-African cases.
Thank you. Now to our second round of questions, Mr. But we need the microphone there. Oh, is that if you want to just approach, and you can use the mic here.
So this is the follow-up of what we were just saying about inclusion and exclusion in Tunisia.
If you could please identify yourself.
I forgot the question. No, so Mark Tesler from the University of Michigan. So you kind of discussed this, and I don't know if there's really more to say, but it's really interesting and important, and so I want to try to push a little bit to see if there is more to say. How should we think about what would happen if there were inclusion of this group? And I mean, I guess it's speculation on your part, but based on the conversations you've had, maybe you have some insights. Would it be just symbolic? I mean, of an expression of people would feel the dignity they felt they didn't have. Somebody took them seriously, somebody cared about them. So that would be the main benefit. It would be symbolic. And if that were the main benefit, would that have any practical consequences? People would then be prepared to be patient, or it wouldn't make a difference. To the extent it's not just symbolic, what would we expect in terms of, I mean, would these people, would the uneducated as included, be kind of marginalized? They say what they want, and then we move on, we heard from them, we just move on. Would there be some groups that would maybe find them a useful ally, and they would be part of some sort of emerging coalition, maybe be national coalition partners or somebody? Would they bring a sensibility or perspective that otherwise wouldn't be there? I mean, are they, I thought this is sort of a question that was asked. I mean, we don't care about the bigger picture, do something concrete that gives us jobs. Or we have a conception of the larger transformation that needs to take place, and we're here to present that point of view. So I don't know if there's more to be said about this, but it seems to me that if there were inclusion, it could mean a lot of different things, and it could have be significant in various ways, or maybe not really significant at all. And to the extent you can take us a little further in how to think about it without trying to be unreasonable, I think that would be really useful.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Then, if I could add two more questions to that. How could you envision the line between inclusion and co-optation? Which I know it's a very tricky one, but we want to be included, we want to be heard, but we actually want to be heard because we want to change. So we don't want to be heard just that we can be seen as being included. So what are indicators that can show people this is inclusion but not co-optation? Given that, of course, the kind of change that maybe people ultimately want can't happen in 2 months. So how do we look at that? And one more question that I had in my notes to ask you. You spoke a lot about how both of these organizations in Tunis looked at jobs from a personal perspective. They wanted personal jobs and personal employment rather than coming up with a strategic economic vision. I know it's a really big question, and I'm opening it up to both of you and to any other experts we have on the table. Why is that the case? Why do you think that the general call has been for employment per se, rather than not for economic transformation and a different kind of economic vision? Any theories or hypotheses behind that? Of course, but
Yeah, great questions again. And yeah, thank you, Mr. Tesla, for pushing a bit further. What would happen if they were included? First of all, I beg to differ when it comes to symbolic inclusion of the piqueteros. I think what is...
It's a question, it's not a statement, not a judgment.
Okay. Of course, this actually links right as a question. So, is it a symbolic inclusion? Is it co-optation? Actually, my colleague Jonas Weipert-Fenner is the Latin American guy, so please take care of all this. And we wrote together just a few thoughts on this question, how to differentiate between inclusion and co-optation. So how do we know it when we see it? It's a blog only so far, but I can send you the link where you can see like the first ideas how to have we have a metric, so it's about exclusion and inclusion. It's about responsiveness to demands. So they have the substantial level and the institutional level. And I think it makes sense to combine them. So inclusion would mean you actually have a certain impact on decisions made, and you have alternatives there. Cooptation would mean you sit on the table, but you don't make a difference, right? In this blog, I think, I used the digital labor movement after 2011, and Kamanaka, one of another big shots of the independent trade union movement, became Ministry of Labor, and this it's a case of cooptation now. But of course, sometimes it's a real thin red line, right? So what is impact? And as we know from social movement theory, most activists are usually disappointed. I don't know of any social movement that, yes, we got it, we want it all. So usually it's disappointment. It doesn't mean that it didn't have an impact. So this is difficult. What could it mean to include the UDC? Yes. Could it mean that now suddenly all unemployed would rally together under the flag of UDC? I have serious doubts about that, because what I saw was fragmentation. There was a lot of distrust, and from the side of the unorganized unemployed, they were saying, like, UDC, they're also politicized. Everyone is afraid of cooperating with someone who's politicized or political. UDC is afraid of other political actors. So this is what creates this fragmentation. This is like a downward spiral, I would say. But I think this is also triggered by some kind of like political or state responses to these protests, because you say, why only personal employment? Because this is what leads to tangible results and quick tangible results, because broad political demands were simply ignored. Of course, it takes time to, if you take them seriously, to implement them, but they were simply ignored. They were really taken up. For example, just one specific demand would have been easy. EDC demanded at one point to have one EDC member being part of the supervisory boards of recruitment procedures. Why not? Good idea. Off the table. I've never found it. And well, if EDC was included, I think rather that it could, and if people could see that this leads to results, maybe this would change the dynamics among the unorganized to at least form groups. They don't even have representatives. Not a guy would speak, and I'm saying guy, females are actually not represented that much. Just to add this on the gender question dimension, but not with EDC. But so I think it could be at least worth trying, and then it could, it would include a leftist voice, and the leftist part of the political spectrum at the moment is completely marginalized, with Nahda and Tunis being like on the economic level. I think they have a lot of common, so like free market economy, pro, private. Oh no, yeah, okay. So pro business if you want, and another point that I was always surprised when you think like, why are they asking this and not that? No one's talking about reforms of the private sector, and I think there, this is a personal note, some change would do good to think not only about the state as state employment, but maybe also state as a regulator and a strong one that could really make sure that decent work is possible in the private sector, reforms of social protection schemes and make them available also for privately employed, giving informal business the chance to become formalized, get access to social protection. I think there are a lot of ways forward, but there's a lack of political will, but also, I have to be fair, on the demand side, this is not found here in the unemployed movement.
Sure, I'm going to pick up as well on this question that you posed of sort of why is everyone talking about employment all the time as a specific type of demand, or even a specific framework within which to understand, why people are mobilizing and acting in certain ways, which I think is a fascinating question. So in short, I think that there are out there like calls for sort of what you might call a broader program of economic transformation, diversification for the interior region, certainly within like the studies department at UGTT, or organizations like the FTAS, which Rania was showing some data from. They're sort of constantly putting out these calls for alternative model of developmentalism, rethinking which industries are being prioritized through growth strategies, through foreign investment, and so on. But I think that when it comes to sort of perhaps local level mobilization, and perhaps we can all think this through a little bit more, it's kind of a hazy idea that I was just writing down, I think employment is a demand that can be both particularistic or individualistic and sort of communal and collective, right? It's kind of fungible in that way, where you can, have a protest with you and your sort of small group of friends saying, we want jobs, and you can also mobilize in a broader sense on behalf of, as Rania was mentioning, changes in the recruitment policies of public companies, or, shifts to the way that recruitment to bureaucracies are constructed. So it has this sort of, transfer potential between particularistic demands and sort of higher level or communal ones, and perhaps that's a reason that employment is sort of able to serve both of those functions, like within a mobilizing society.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor before we ask our speakers to wrap it up? Any other questions or comments? Okay. Do you have any concluding comments you'd like to make?
I think we said quite enough. There are only two of us on the panel, so I think we got the opportunity to speak a lot, which is great. So thank you all for your questions and comments. Very helpful.
Before we close the session, I just want to point out that we have a keynote presentation today at 5:30 by Dr. Amaney Jamal, talking about Trump's presidency, Islamophobia, and the Middle East, which is most definitely a hot topic. And for those of you who will still be here on Monday, we have 4 Princeton professors who will be speaking on the role of academia during Trump's presidency. Dr. Mark Weisinger, Dr. Amaney Jamal, Dr. Stephen Macedo, and Dr. Helen Milner, which I would say is academics. This is a very critical question for us all. So if you happen to be here Monday, there will be that talk at 10 o'clock in the morning. And of course, there's another talk today at 5:30. And with that, thank you very much for your time, and thank you again for the researchers for all your work.
Well, I mean, no,